Welcome to On Defense and Security, a podcast that examines domestic and international defense and military affairs. Through conversations, we will bridge the gap between academic research and policy and provide a platform for informed discussions, enabling our listeners to better understand critical issues.
So thanks everyone for joining the CIDP podcast. I'm joined today by Robert Currie, who's a professor of law at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University. He works in international and transnational criminal law, focusing on things like cross-border crime, extradition, and his work is widely cited in the courts, Canadian courts, including the Supreme Court of Canada. Also, Dr. Amy Mack, assistant professor in the Department of New Media at the University of Lethbridge and Canada Research Chair in Digital Extremism. Her work focuses on digital cultures, online hate, populism, far-right extremism, and so on. I've asked both of them to join me today to talk about Alberta separatism and the Alberta independence movement. So maybe we can start just on some of the history of it. Whoever wants to take it. What is this kind of movement, and we've seen pop up, a kind of recurring phenomenon in Alberta? How new is it, or what's new about it today as opposed to how we've seen it in the past? Whoever wants to take that.
I can start because it lets me get on my soapbox, right? Which is to say that there is really nothing new about the separatist movement in Alberta, broadly speaking. A lot of times I think folks want to think about it in terms of, right now the 51st state rhetoric coming out of the US, or maybe they want to think about it in terms of Wexit, which was sort of an iteration of the Brexit movement. But if we look back in the archives, this sort of discourse has been happening in this part of the country since the 1800s. There's this really beautiful quote that describes what would become Alberta as like the poorly treated stepchild of Ottawa, and Ottawa being sort of a stepmother figure. So this sort of feeling of getting the short end of the stick, of not being treated properly, that what would become Western alienation is a really long-standing feature of political and I would say social culture here in Alberta. So while I would say maybe the flavors of separatism change over time, in part that's because of the technical affordances of the media landscape. Social media has clearly changed things. It does respond to other political pressures, like obviously the 51st state rhetoric has shaped things in a particular sort of way. But I would say like the underlying grievances and themes have been around for centuries at this point.
Rob, anything to add on to that? Or?
Well, I mean, this is very much Amy's expertise more than mine, but I really like, being able to bounce off the word grievance, because it lets us talk about something that we don't talk about often as Canadians, which is we have our own history of grievance politics in this country. And it's both interesting and textured and annoying and pointy. I come at it from the perspective of Atlantic Canada. And, they don't think of us as being really heavy into the grievance end of things, because there's no doubt Atlantic Canada has been a net benefiter from Confederation. We were there at the beginning and it was seen as an advantageous deal. But if you dig into the history, and we're all able to do this, you find things, right? There was a deliberate decision to promote industrial policy, focusing on manufacturing in Ontario to the actual economic detriment of Atlantic Canada. There's a case to be made by Newfoundland that in some ways they were better off as an independent country. Well, they were until 1949, based now on how the feds desperately mismanaged the fishery, right? So those dynamics are definitely, they're part of our overall makeup as a country. I'd love to say, hey, let's all hold hands and say acknowledge our grievances in common, but that's not how that all works. But a separatist type dialogues, and we haven't even talked about Quebec yet. Yeah, like very much part of the fabric, and probably inevitably so in a country that is the size of this one and has the constitutional order that this one has, which has a lot of decentralized power. And that is still an experiment. Canada is very much an experiment. We don't know whether it's a successful one yet or not. And regrettably and, nervously, we're kind of starting to confront some of those dynamics now about some of the outgrowths of the experiment.
And I would say the folks that I work with would definitely have an answer to your question, which is that Canada is a failed experiment and we should redo it.
Is this alienation almost always economic? Like whether you're talking about Atlantic Canada, the prairie provinces, Alberta, is it always like we're being taken advantage of somehow, or we're being mismanaged somehow? Is it at the core of it this economic issue, or is there some cultural dynamics as well?
I think within the Alberta context, it's really hard to figure out where economics start and culture ends and vice versa. So there's some really great work done by some political scientists at the University of Alberta. Jared Wesley is leading the charge there. And he is doing some really interesting work around what is an Albertan. And so he does this really cool focus group where he asks people to draw your stereotypical Albertan. And it doesn't matter if he's doing this in downtown Calgary or in rural southern Alberta, the vast majority of people draw either a farmer or rancher or someone who works in extractive industries, so like a miner or an oil worker, and they're almost always men. So this it doesn't matter who the person is who's drawing this, we have a very strong brand about what it means culturally to be Albertan, and that is very much rooted in the economics. So this sort of grievances are kind of the same, like they're bound up together and it's really hard to pull apart. So when something is a threat to Alberta, if we're understanding Albertans as these two very classic archetypes, it's always an attack on the economics, and an attack on the economics therefore becomes an attack on us culturally, because those are the stories we tell about ourselves, right?
Can I jump in there too?
Sure.
Again, as an outside observer, right? I've lived in Atlantic Canada pretty much all of my life. Not that, there aren't lots of folks in common. They always say Fort McMurray is the second biggest city in Newfoundland. So Atlantic Canadians built a lot of that contemporary Alberta. But I sort of want to try out an idea on Amy, because when I look as an outside observer, but one who, tries to pay attention to politics and economics and that kind of thing, the story that Albertans tell themselves is an interesting one, in that it's a real independentist, the people who colonize this part of the prairies and the hard scrabble folks, and they pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And we only have to go back as far as Ralph Klein to see massive government intervention in the economy. It's like the story that's told doesn't really match up with the facts very well. And I wonder too, and again, I'm just an unwashed guy with an opinion. I wonder too about the influence of American politics and American culture, and the appeal of that rowdy Western farmer cowboy type.
Yeah, I think you're totally correct. And that is the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And it's the story that we export to other people, right? Sort of the mythology around colonization is a big part of the political culture here, right? Like we were the right kind of people. Our grandparents were like, that hardy Northern European stock. That's language that, Stephen Harper used to describe the folks who emigrated to this part of the world. And we were, in rugged individuals who were capable of clearing the plains and conquering this part of the world. And that comes to that leads into a sense of entitlement, right? Because we were the ones who built this part of the world, we are then entitled to control it. And any sort of outside intervention is seen as a threat to that legacy and to our inheritance, so to speak. But you're right, there has been a lot of subsidies. Like if you look at the way the oil industry is treated now, it's radically different than pre-Ralph Klein. So the story that we tell ourselves about capitalism is also really different. Mm-hmm. And I think people intuitively know that something is going wrong here. But because we have these really strong myths, these really strong stories that we tell ourselves, it's almost creating a wall where folks can't quite see what is actually happening politically, which gets in the way of other kinds of progressive work in this province.
Where does immigration and some of these kind of demographic shifts that are happening all over Canada, but in Alberta as well, impacting? Because I hear this conversation all the cultural shifts and demographic shifts in Alberta are blamed federally, and therefore that's another reason why we need to exert our independence or leave entirely.
And I mean, it's deeply ironic because Danielle Smith ran a huge immigration campaign. Alberta is Calling was all over the rest of Canada, getting folks to come to this province. And she's now completely turned around and wants to have a referendum on immigration and whether or not immigrants should be allowed to access healthcare within the first year of being here. And so it's been a really horrible moment right now for anti-immigrant rhetoric. Yeah, and I think one of the things that is interesting about Alberta in my work is actually the way in which Alberta is framed by other parts of Canada. So one of the things that I see a lot in sort of broader far-right Canadian discourse is about how Alberta is kind of the only part of Canada that is like, quote unquote, uncorrupted. That is like the last bastion of whiteness, of conservative values, of Christian values. So while Alberta is also creating sort of this discourse, I've also seen like the rest of Canada within far-right spaces also propping up this idea about Alberta as being under threat and how folks should move to Alberta if they want to get out of Ontario, which is woke and overrun by, you know, the quote unquote wrong type of immigrants, right? So it's this sort of inside-outside discourse right now, which is very strange.
This Wexit movement that I guess you can trace to the Brexit era or around 2019, was that a new infusion of like a new idea or is that the same in terms of how you see it, this kind of separatism? Because I think that's when a lot of new people started to talk about they want to leave, right? It's not just about we're being taken advantage of. We want rights. We want to have some sort of leverage over Ottawa. We want to more rights from Ottawa. But this is like, let's actually leave. That's when I think it hit the public or the mainstream imagination, I guess. Do you see where do you see that coming from? Is that something new, or is that just like we've noticed it more recently?
I have a follow-up question for the two of you before I answer your question, which is, was this the first time that the two of you kind of saw this sort of separatism? Because sometimes when I'm talking about this, you know, separatism is sort of the air that I breathe. It's like a fish doesn't know that they're in water. And so I'm curious because like Wexit just was kind of a blip for many of us. And I did find that a lot of people were honestly just kind of put off by the name. Like they're like, we like the values, but Wexit is such a terrible name that it was actually hard to get people to rally behind. So I'm wondering if folks from outside of Alberta, you know, who were sort of maybe responding to like, oh my goodness, Brexit actually happened, and now the Albertans are talking. So like, I actually wonder how much of this was happening outside of Alberta rather than actually inside of Alberta. So I don't know if you can reach back into your minds to 2019 and reflect on that at all.
No, I mean, that's the first time I think I started seeing people in Ontario talking about, oh, Alberta wants to leave. That doesn't mean it's the first time that it happened. It's the first time that I remember like hearing it more loudly. Because before then, there was alienation, economics, equalization payments. You know, it was very like boring policy. And this is when it was like this kind of brand of Wexit, I guess, splashed across other parts of Canada. And yeah, it was a little bit more scary because you see how stupid Brexit was and how much damage it would done to the economy over there. And so you were like, oh, these guys actually want to leave also, right? And so that was when it hit my consciousness anyway, in a more mainstream way.
Yeah, I can certainly remember hearing, you know, this suggestion from time to time over 25 years. The volume would get ratcheted up. You know, the West wants in. Certainly, Preston Manning and then Harper leading into that stream that took over the Conservative Party. I think maybe a way to describe it is a lot of stories were told about sovereignty in Alberta, not necessarily about separation, but you know, we want to run ourselves. We blame Trudeau for everything, senior and then eventually junior, and we want more control. this sense of sovereignty, the sense of independence, political separation, as you say, Amy, was more of a blip than until the dialogue around Brexit and then the fundamental disconnect from reality that accompanied all of that in terms of what happened to the British public. And and again, the conversations are different, totally different conversations. Some unmoored from facts, and some reflecting real dynamics.
Yeah.
So that's it's been around for a while. But yeah, I think I agree with Amar. The edge of it got sharper around 2019.
That's very interesting, because one of the things that I have found in my research and just being an Albertan, living in this part of the world for most of my life, there's always been a lot of discourse about like joining Montana. And part of that is because we do have a lot of cultural overlap with Montana and Idaho. A lot of Albertans do business over the border. We have family over the border. Particularly in southern Alberta, there's a lot of kinship ties between Alberta and Utah. And so like there's always been this sort of sense that like maybe we would be better off with a different sort of union. And maybe we actually have more in common politically, socially, and economically with those two states, or the third one if you want to include Utah in that. So while it maybe wasn't necessarily the like political separatist discourse that I think was amplified by Brexit and then Wexit, and certainly we're seeing now, I think there was always the question of like, is this actually the best arrangement for Albertans? Do we actually have more in common with folks in Montana than we do in Atlantic Canada? And the answer to that might actually be yes. Whether or not that's a justification for leaving Canada and joining the US is a completely different story.
But it's very real, right? I can remember studying political science as a young person, and the analysts and the historians will say there's a powerful presence of north-south flows, economic flows in particular, but cultural flows in the history of the place. On this end of the country, it's New England, right? And the historic trade between Atlantic Canada and even Quebec and New England was dominant until middle of the 20th century. So I think that's very much part of the fabric.
Yeah, there's an alternate timeline in which this part of the country is in the United States, right? Like the Postal Service and the railroad is really what saved us from that alternate timeline.
How much did Trudeau, I guess, the second Trudeau, I guess, give this movement a jetpack? And because there is this anxiety around Trudeau #1 and the National Energy Program and in the 80s, where he kind of put controls over Alberta's oil industry and things like that, and so that grievance, I guess, was that just transplanted to Trudeau's son and given a boost that way?
Yeah, and I mean, like, the great irony is that Trudeau and our Alberta NDP got us a pipeline, right? Like, if you look at all of the prime ministers and how they have treated Alberta, particularly with our energy sector, like Justin Trudeau actually did a favor to Alberta in a way that Stephen Harper never did. But I do think that there is it's a tradition in Alberta to hate the Trudeaus. So like there was nothing that Justin Trudeau could have done to step outside of the shadow of his father. That was always going to go poorly, no matter what. But I think your sort of accelerated jetpack metaphor is very accurate.
That's also in the focus group drawings as a farmer and a miner, and then they're like standing on Trudeau or something.
Yes. Yeah. No, there are the Trudeau flags all over the place. There still are. They're all over the trucks. The flags still fly. People still have the shirts and the hoodies, even though he's been gone for over a year now. Yeah, it's a cultural practice in Alberta to hate the Trudeaus.
Here too, by the way, a minority. I would call it a minority practice, but that there's an element of that, particularly in rural and small town Nova Scotia and the Maritimes. But I think too, you see, Trudeau Fisk comes along in 2015, and then I mean, there's a thing happening already. Then, right? There's a populist thing happening, and that's when I began to hear the phrase, Laurentian elites a lot, which I place in that in that regional disparity conversation, and emanating from Alberta, but certainly other places as well. I mean, my eyes hurt from rolling every time I hear it, and yet, it rests on certain dynamics that are real. I know I don't mean to sound dismissive. I think I often come across kind of harsh in these conversations because I'm big on Canadian unity and I'm infuriated by what's going on, both in Alberta and Quebec. But so that's all of that historic Alberta resentment of central Canada and of Trudeau pair is swept up in that larger dialogue, that populist dialogue. That's pretty harsh there, because not long after that, of course, we get Trump in the US, and then everything begins to swirl in a different way.
Yeah.
Amy, like what in terms of what it actually looks like on the ground, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? Who's behind this kind of organizing? Is it like one organization? Is it a couple of leaders? Is it kind of leftover people from the convoy period? Like what is the organizational and I guess personality dynamics look like now?
I think the thing that is so tricky about this right now is that it's a hydra, right?
Mm.
Like there are various groups, there are various figures, and it's fertile ground. I've mixed my metaphors now. But we have at the top, we have a political party in power that is willing to stoke the flames of separatism for their own political gain, have made lots of trips to the United States, and the discourse coming out of that party is often pro-Trump, which I think exacerbates some of the 51st state rhetoric, which is another piece of the puzzle, which is the 51st state rhetoric. I have found a great deal of division within groups when it comes to, when we say sovereignty, do we mean Alberta as its own country, or do we mean Alberta leaves Canada to join the 51st state? So there's a little bit of a divide there.
Yeah.
The groups are also, I would say, still dealing with the fallout from the Coutts border blockade. Some of those individuals were quite prominent in the Take Back Alberta movement, in the Alberta Prosperity Project. And there have been a lot of, as we know with far-right groups and with populist movements, personalities often clash and there's fracturing and things move and mutate. So it's always changing. So we have those sort of political party level. We have some of the organization, like I said, the Alberta Prosperity Project, Take Back Alberta. There's the 1905 Project, which is a split off from that. And then we just have the folks who are just living their regular lives and having to interact with this in a really mainstream way, which I actually think is one of the most concerning things. People are always sending me pictures of the sort of Alberta sovereignty groups showing up at like potlucks and community events, and they have referendum signups at the post office. And so it's kind of everywhere right now. But the flip side of that is the pro-Canada, the Forever Canada movement is actually quite robust as well. So while I think it is really easy to get caught up in the fact that there's this multi-headed hydra of forces, both internally and externally to Alberta, there are a lot of people who, like Rob, are really irritated with this discourse, really frustrated with the idea that Alberta would not stay in Canada. So we have the Forever Canada referendum petitions right now, and we have a lot of people who are talking about this. And it's doing really interesting things within right-wing political spaces too, right? There are folks who have voted for the United Conservative Party who are like, I cannot vote for these people again if they are going to continue to push the separatism thing, because I'm a conservative, but I'm a conservative Canadian. So there is some rumblings that there might be another right-wing conservative party that will maybe pull folks from the UCP, and the UCP might not be so united. It's really messy, and it is rapidly evolving, again, because people are incapable of getting along for extended periods of time. But what I will say is I am surprised at the longevity of particularly the Alberta Prosperity Project. I assumed that would have folded by now. It hasn't. And that tells me, there's money behind that and there's organization behind that in a way that maybe hasn't been in the past.
Folded, why? Because of just egos?
Ego, infighting, losing steam, losing momentum. Like if we look at the Coutts border blockade, there was a really big push to support the folks who were arrested and then stood trial. And then that has really petered out over time. It's like it's a small group of really committed individuals, whereas the APP continues to hold events across the province. Their social media groups just keep growing. Yeah, it was not what I had anticipated happening with the APP.
Well, one thing I'm curious about too, Amy, is so a month ago, or a little over a month ago, I published a piece about Alberta separatism in an international law context. And in between the hate mail and the death threats, I got a couple of emails from people who talked about the APP and associated groups as part of a larger quiet movement that they're establishing organizations in other provinces, in Saskatchewan, in Ontario. And certainly, I mean, some of it sounded like a conspiracy, but some of it sounded, plausible, I would say. And certainly allegations of foreign money, and American at least. So I wonder, have you heard any rumblings about that? Because this is a couple of random emails that I got, but it was enough to think, wow, okay, what's going on?
I think in my work, that would speak to like a fear of those things happening, a fear of this becoming bigger and more unwieldy. The idea of these things popping up in Saskatchewan makes a lot of sense to me, because oftentimes Saskatchewan does and says things that Alberta does, but because Alberta is just louder and maybe a little bit more aggressive and unpleasant in how they say things, Saskatchewan can sometimes like fly under the radar. Like they've done really horrible stuff when it comes to anti-trans legislation, but they don't get nearly as much sort of airtime as Alberta does when we do the exact same thing. Yeah, I understand why it feels like a little bit of a conspiracy theory, and I suspect that those comments are coming from a place of fear and anxiety and anticipation rather than actual data. I think rather than like an organized top-down approach, what we're probably seeing are just groups mobilizing around those long-standing grievances in this current moment.
Speaking of data, is there a sense of what the polling shows? You talk about the Hydra and the diversity of opinion within these movements, but what do the stats show in terms of the percentage of people in Alberta that could support a referendum or support separatism?
I mean, it depends on the poll. Danielle Smith likes to point to polls that show a lot higher interest in leaving, and then you have polls that are as low as 10%, right? And to go back to the work of Jared Wesley, one of the things that he did recently was to poll Albertans on what their actual opinions are on things like climate change, sovereignty, trans healthcare, education, those sort of like controversial things, what their actual opinions are, and then to poll on what they think the average Albertans' political opinions are. And the disparity between the two was actually quite stark. People assume that Albertans are a lot more conservative and right-wing on most issues than we actually are. So based on that and based on some of the polls, my sense is that the vast majority of Albertans do not want to separate, are not interested in separating. But I also think we need to consider the fact that many of us are really overwhelmed and fatigued right now. And so that pushback is maybe not getting the same level of airtime as the very loud minority of people, right? Because I think, to go back to your earlier question, I would say many Albertans have grievances towards Ontario. I have grievances towards the federal government. That doesn't mean I want to leave Canada, right? So I think, and again, I think it depends on the question. Like, do you have animosity towards the feds? Yes. Do you want to leave Canada? Probably not.
What does Rob mentioned the United States. I'm curious what the foreign interference angle is here. Like, are you, aside from a few politicians who've gone on talk shows and like really encouraged Alberta to do what they want to do, are we seeing any? So that I guess that's important too. Like, what does the media landscape look like in terms of what Albertans are consuming that's coming from the United States, and then what is there a financial and organizational component to it as well in terms of getting these movements and organizations ramped up?
I can speak to sort of the media piece more than the financial piece. And that's again to say that the idea that Albertans are now consuming American media more is also sort of ahistorical. Like we have always been incorporating and consuming this media coming out of the States. Like Fox News has always been a big part of the political discourse here. And again, a lot of that has to do with that north-south flow. People are spending time in the United States. So it's not just that like media is coming across the border, but people are coming across the border and in both ways. So yeah, there's a huge impact of American media here. There's huge support for Trump, if you count the number of signs and flags that you see driving down the streets. So like that can't be underestimated. But I would also say that that is not a particularly new thing for this part of the world either, right? Like I would suspect there's a lot more consumption of Fox News than CBC in a lot of the spaces that I work in.
I mean, it seems to be, and this is really more your bag, Amar, but the foreign interference piece is so important, and if anything, it's not getting enough airtime either. Other than the high profile stuff, as you say, senior American government officials literally interfering in our sovereignty by encouraging the breakup of Canada. Like, again, people are not angry enough about this, but we know from the Foreign Interference Commission, the Russians and the Chinese and the government of India are here and they're messing around. Now, there's lots of different goals going on, lots of oppression of diaspora, but certainly the Russian presence in particular is about generally destabilizing Western society. And what greater way to destabilize Canada than to fan this flame as much as you can. And that it works lockstep with certain elements in the Trump administration too, who like the fracturing. I don't know that they would necessarily enjoy having Canada as the 51st state. The joke everyone keeps making is, it would be a state of Democrats, like 40 million of them. You might not actually want that in the US. But weirdly, the Russian and the American interests converge in that place. And now this is totally anecdotal, and Mario probably shut off my camera after I say it, but I wanted to try to get a sense of what's going on in some of that space. So I joined a Facebook group called, I don't know, 51st State or something like that, because I wanted to see what was going on. And it's colorful, as you can imagine, and it's a mixture of stuff and of people, which anybody would expect. But I'm not trained in any of that stuff. I'm just somebody who reads a lot and pays attention. But the amount of obvious foreign interference there is shocking, right? The amount of Russian bots that are probably Russian bots that are circulating. What they're circulating is a lot of pro-American memes, Trump in the armor of Christian crusaders and the Canadian moose and the American eagle holding hands. It's all very weird and disturbing, but lots of that and more subtle stuff as well. Criticism of Carney, promotion of a particular American foreign policy initiative on a given day, whatever that looks like. So, we need to be alive to that, and I can only imagine our security services are keeping an eye on it. But I think we ignore it to our peril, certainly.
Yeah, and I think there needs to be a balance of understanding that there is foreign interference. There are bots that are absolutely happening in these spaces, and the intrusion of AI into all of our lives is really accelerating a lot of that, I think. And the fact that this already existed in Alberta. Like, I am really resistant to the idea that this is all an external thing that is happening in Alberta and that we haven't been doing this for well over a century. Those memes predate Trump, right? Like, they predate, or I would say they predate Trump 2.0 at least. And so there's some nuance that needs to be there about like it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B, and they come together in a really wonderful way.
Or you can say like column B wouldn't resonate if it didn't exist already in column A, right?
Exactly.
So I mean, speaking about the Russians in America, it's absolutely their prerogative to find the fault lines that already exist in a society and try to make them worse, right? And so yes, it exists on the ground for sure, but then how can we give it a boost and how can we make things worse? And yeah, AI, a lot of these images are AI produced, and the poor grammar and stuff clearly point to foreign interference. But I mean, to your point, Rob, like I don't think we're talking about it in the language of foreign interference, right? We're just like, oh, look at idiot Trump saying something on TV, and we just kind of laugh it off. But it's like, oh, like if you stop for a second, it's like, oh, it's a foreign president talking about the division of Canadian sovereignty, right? And so I don't know that it's being framed in that way enough, and said loudly enough, but because everything he does is just kind of seen as a joke and people dismiss it. But yeah, if you stop for a second, it's like a big deal. If any other president had done that, it would have been a big deal, right? And
Totally. And not just him, right? But again, government officials hosting the Alberta separatists for meetings. Right? That's even quite apart from international law norms, because nobody believes in international law anymore. They stopped believing in it about 3 weeks ago, as far as I can make out. But that is such a departure from the relationship we have had historically with the U.S., which has been so important, obviously, and relatively friendly and respectful of boundaries, and with a quiet sense of the need for effective governance and the desire largely not to interfere. It was the president of France, it was de Gaulle, who came here and threw gasoline on Quebec separatism, right? It wasn't anybody American. Relationships between presidents and prime ministers have come and gone, but the disruption there, I think, it's exactly what you say. It's an entirely different element in the U.S. that doesn't value that relationship at all and wants to separate the fault line, increase the width of the fault line as much as they can.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about the legal side of this before I let you guys go, because I think that isn't necessarily making the rounds enough in terms of what people are consuming. Because yeah, we're all talking about the rhetoric and the media side of it, but like, Rob, can you maybe walk us through, in general terms, I guess, what is any legal process, or what is the legal process any province would have to follow if they decided that they're going to leave Canada? Like what is the mechanism by which something like that could happen?
Yeah. So this has a really well-textured legal backdrop that, as you say, is not getting emphasized in the conversation enough. Arising out of the 95 referendum in Quebec, the feds passed the Clarity Act. Right? And the Clarity Act sets out an actual process that governs any situation in which a province would, or a territory, I guess, would seek to separate from Canada. So I think it's important to ring that bell really loudly, that there is a process entirely within the jurisdiction of the federal government that runs this process. So there are rules, and to be fair to the Alberta Prosperity Project and other elements in that debate, they don't ignore the Clarity Act. Like you see, we've gotten legal opinions, and there are a couple of lawyers who are quite prominent in the race. So the law is part of the dialogue. I've been on some websites of those organizations. They're a little selective in their treatment of it. Like this is a thing. This is not a big deal, and then some important part is missing. For example, negotiating with Indigenous groups who would have land claims and so on. That part just seems to get ignored entirely. But the process itself is that there would need to be something like a referendum. There needs to be an expression of will of the people of the particular province. But what the vote has to show, and the language is interesting, right? The vote has to show that a large portion of the people of the province actually want to separate. It has to be an expression of will on behalf or on the part of all of the people in the province, not just the people who vote. Right? It's really carefully worded to say, 50% plus one of the people who vote doesn't get you there, unless we can look at it and say, yes, that's actually representative of the will of the majority of Albertans. And that's a really important piece that's being missed. Now, I think everybody will want everybody to get out to vote. So you do maybe end up with high voter turnout, but the determination's got to be made whether it meets that higher threshold. at that point, sorry, go ahead.
No, so that's important because I think what Amy was getting at earlier about the fatigue and stuff, like you might just have a bunch of people stay home. So you're saying that would, even if they stayed home, that wouldn't matter. Like it's still it's not like they've relinquished their right to have a say. It's like no, the numbers still have to add up at the end.
Yeah, and if a particular referendum doesn't produce that result, it's over until the process starts again. And like there's no exit door. The process could definitely start again. But if only 40% of voting age Albertans vote, and 58% of them say yes, that's not representative of the will of the people of Alberta, right? And it's not there's no bright line. It's not a clearly identified threshold, but it's got to meet that. So at that point, negotiations definitely kick in. And, a lot of considerations are taken into account in the negotiations. And after the Quebec scare, they were careful to say we're having this dialogue as a confederation. So the considerations of Canadian territorial integrity, the considerations of all Canadians, and of our collective sovereign interests are part of this dialogue as well. It's not how many tanks do you get and how many planes do you get, and will you get to keep all the oil and how much of the debt, right? It's a much, much larger debate, which again, you can imagine those conversations going on for a long time. But then the final stage is a constitutional amendment. Everybody's missing this. The act requires that we amend the Constitution. And both of you, I know, are familiar with our constitutional amendment formula, which means all the provinces have to agree. So it's never going to happen, is my call. But, and I don't know how far you want me to take this, Amar, but here's the thing that I'm concerned about is not that we might get to the end of that process and there could be a constitutional amendment. It's that there will be a referendum and it won't really matter how many people vote because the Americans and the tech bros and the Russians will start to fan the flames. And then there will be civil disorder of some kind. Like that's my immediate concern. I'm not actually concerned about whether the Clarity Act process will result in Alberta leaving Confederation. I'm worried about the on the ground dissension and violence, and they're trying to repress us. We voted in favor. Like, why didn't we separate the next day? Simplistic dialogue. Yeah. I have more opinions.
Well, I mean, that was going to be my next question is what, because someone in America, I forget who it was, will say, we'll recognize after the referendum, we'll recognize it as an independent country. So according to what you've been laid out here, it actually matters little what the international community has to say, right? In terms of legally, like, because in every other country, yeah, you do need international recognition that there's a separate country or self-determination, et cetera. But so how does that work if there is a referendum and let's say the majority of Albertans do vote or 50% or something support separation, and then America comes in and says we recognize Alberta as an independent country. What's the role of that kind of recognition internationally?
Sure. Well, there's an international law piece quite separate from this process under Canadian constitutional law, which I've just been talking about. And the international law around self-determination, which is the principle of law that governs this, there's a number of pieces to it, but one piece is it takes territorial integrity very, very carefully. So if this were to get before an international court, and that's a whole other ball of wax, like even getting it to an international court would be unusual. If it got to an international court and the international court applied the law, it would say the law presumes territorial integrity, and will only allow separation under three circumstances: colonialism, which this isn't. I said in my piece, the Indigenous people in Alberta might say, well, let's talk about colonialism, but Alberta has not been colonized. Sort of heinous repression, right? Like economic and political repression, like one country conquering a particular people. The third one is if the group in question is not able to exercise their right to self-determination within the context of the particular country. That means that, they are politically repressed. They can't express their culture. They can't express their language, their ethnic practices, their religious practices, whatever they happen to be. So imagine an actually repressed minority. in an authoritarian country. That's where the law provides it. Yes, in those circumstances, you might end up with a situation where independence could be declared and it would be lawful under international law. Now, that begs the question of, are Albertans a people for this purpose, which is probably where I should have started. It's the threshold question. The group in question has to be a people in order to even get access to the entire package of stuff. And based on, there's no sort of definitive definition, there's no set down definition, but based on comparison to every other group that's been called a people for this purpose, I mean, a province of Canada doesn't qualify, definitely. So the wild card, though, sorry I'm talking so much, but the wild card is a declaration of independence by a group might attract exactly what you pointed out, which is countries that are interested in creating friction on the ground, saying, yeah, we recognize Alberta. And the worst case scenario is the Americans, like, you can't predict what they're going to do. The Americans might recognize, Russia might recognize, Russia's got all these vassal states that might say, okay, yeah, we'll recognize Alberta too. And then you're into a mess, right? And it's a mess because if we can even get it before an international court, that only goes so far, because not every country in the world is going to acknowledge the jurisdiction of the court. So the political firefight, excuse me, that precedes any actual determination is the concern.
So, Amy, everything that Rob just laid out, how do you see all of that sitting with the people that you watch on the ground? Do they know that background? Do they know that legal background? Do they care about that legal background? And the three kind of things that he laid out about, heinous repression and all that, like, I can see them making the arguments that all of that applies with Alberta alienation, right?
Yeah, and Rob, I've also seen the work of these various lawyers who have very much made a little bit of a grift out of their work with the APP. And it does give sort of a veneer of legitimacy to their groups, because when I talk to folks, I'm like, legally, I don't think this can happen. And they'll be like, oh, we have this lawyer and this is all the ways in which it can happen. I think the problem when dealing with many of the folks that I work with is facts don't really matter, right? Like, this echoes the conversations around COVID and vaccines and those sorts of things. I'm not 100% certain that if I brought them all of Rob's brilliance, that they would go, oh, I see that this is pointless, I'm going to change my mind. I don't think that that's going to happen. But I share Rob's concern about, like, I'm not actually worried about us separating. I'm worried about all of the chaos that is going to happen leading up to any of this. And to Amar's point, any chaos that would happen after a referendum, right? The Coutts border blockade was a terrifying experience for many of us. Like, the fact that there was such civil unrest, the fact that there were firearms, there were explosives. And I think that has shaped how people feel about these sorts of movements. So I think that there is a heightened sense of anxiety amongst all of us, really, regardless of where you sit on this political spectrum or in regards to this question. And I think we are all really concerned about the idea of violence that's being stoked by the United States or other state actors. And I think it's really politically strategic for our provincial government to continue to fan these flames as well. It distracts from the fact that we have a healthcare crisis. We have a housing crisis. Like, the economy is terrible. Oil is really expensive. But that's not benefiting us in this moment because of the way we deal with our oil companies. So yeah, like, I don't have very good feelings about how any of this goes for the next few years, regardless of what a referendum has to say. And I think it will continue to eat away at the social cohesion of our communities, both small and large. My work is mostly in rural spaces, and this, like COVID, is a real fracturing point for many families. Which of course we know leads to spending more time online, radicalizing in particular spaces, becoming further and further detached from reality, which means coming back to a cohesive society is looking less and less possible for many of us in this province. So Rob, I share your anxiety
How did elbows up and that kind of this kind of Canadian cohesion movement under Carney and with the tariffs and anti-Trump, like how did that trickle into this movement, I guess?
Well, I think one of the things with elbows up is Charlie Angus was not seen as being part of the liberal sort of set. So I think that actually made it easier for people to like rally around him before he stepped down and was no longer part of the political apparatus. What I saw a lot of was by Canadian. So seeing it as like an economic thing rather than a political or a cultural thing. But then we do have a lot of pro-Trump sentiment here, right? And so, yeah, I don't think that we saw the elbows up in quite the same way that we saw in other parts of the province, but it's a huge part of things now. Like there's lots of the Buy Canadian signs at all of the grocery stores, and although I do think that has waned a little bit, it's hard for folks to maintain a boycott, right? Mm-hmm. Eventually, you go back to your old buying practices.
I would have hoped there would be a bump from having an Albertan prime minister, in a sense, right? Like the West wants him. The guy's from Edmonton, essentially, but no, he's not perceived that way, is he?
Yeah. No, he went skating with the Edmonton Oilers. He's a good friend of Daryl Cates, who owns the Edmonton Oilers. Like none of that will ever shake off the veneer of Ottawa. Like Carney has left us. He's not an Albertan anymore, as far as many people are concerned. And frankly, like I share some of that sentiment, right? Like I think when you are in that sort of position, your loyalties are different. Yeah. And if you are just a regular Albertan living here, right?
And as I always say, within extremists, taken from extremist movements, is the sellout is hated much more vigorously than someone from the outside who you didn't take seriously to begin with, right? So him being from Edmonton and then betraying Alberta would be seen as much worse, much worse than, yeah.
And Stephen Harper was from Calgary. Still in Calgary, but like he didn't do anything for the province. So even if Carney did do things for the province, I don't think it would be read in that particular way, right? So.
And as you pointed out, Trudeau's son did lots for the province, and yet facts don't matter.
Yep.
So I mean, last question, I guess. Is there a solution to this that you both see, like aside from the legal impossibilities, how does Carney do something to turn this around economically? Is there anything that the federal government can do to kind of, I guess, reduce this sentiment even further than it is? If it's 10%, 15%, it can still cause a lot of damage, I think. Or is it just a 100-year-old murmur that will just continue to murmur below the surface of Albertan politics?
Are there any, and let me ask, because you're kind of the focus of this question, Amy, is there anything to be learned from the Quebec referendum in 95 when there was a protracted, energetic yes campaign, or I guess no campaign, like no to separation, and yes to we embrace Quebec, we welcome Quebec, it's an important part of Canadian identity? Because I think that I'm just guessing, but I get a sense there's a feeling from the federal government that any energy we try to put towards that now will just be reflected back in negativity. So it's better to leave it. But if there's going to be a referendum, surely there's got to be a stay campaign.
Well, I mean, there is a stay campaign right now, right? Like there is the Forever Canada campaign. They are petitioning now, and I suspect they will get the signature. So we will have a referendum on staying in Canada or not. This is negative, but I don't think this sentiment goes away. And it's because it is the roots of this province, right? It's been a thing since the 1800s, since before Alberta was even a province. And I think it's going to stick with us until we have really profound changes to the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And I don't see that happening anytime soon, in part because those stories benefit the left as well as the right. Like I don't see really any push to change the narrative that Albertans have about ourselves. I think we can make inroads in small ways. Most of my work focuses on community-based approaches to countering extremism. And so I think we can make inroads in small ways. Whether or not that trickles up in any meaningful way, TBD. I think the other option is just getting rid of the internet entirely.
Yep.
That might be a benefit to us here and in other ways.
But Rob would really miss those Facebook pages he's joined, though. Like,
I'm in all of those. They're awful.
It's entertaining. Yeah.
So the referendum is supposed to be in October, is that right? Or
yes, that is the ideal. And I believe that is also when we're going to have our referendum on immigration. So October will be an interesting time in this province.
I can't help but
yeah.
Watch this space. And I can't help but, I feel the cynicism of Danielle Smith and that government, right? Like, it's because people are being disenabled from looking around the world and seeing what's going on and saying, wow, like, this simply adds another problem to our already problematic existence, instead of, trying to maintain some kind of equilibrium while we all try to get along. But that's, we have Zuckerberg and Elon and the rest of those bandits to thank for that.
Yep.
On that note, thank you both. That was excellent. We'll watch the space for October and have you both back on to see the fallout, I guess, in terms of what happens next.
I'll be broadcasting from my bunker as the Civil War rages in Alberta.
Oh man. Thanks. Thank you both. That was great.
Yeah, my pleasure.